Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Jeffery. I am your host today. I'm back in the breakout room at an event we're at in Orlando, Florida with Todd Yoder. Todd, will you give a quick introduction of yourself? I know you've been on the Treasury Update podcast several times before.
I can't think of a better place to be in beautiful, sunny Orlando, considering I spoke to my wife yesterday and it's cold in Dallas, Texas. It's great to be here and always fun to chat Treasury with you.
Yes, we had a good event the last couple of days, and today's topic is part of the Outlook series, and it's the future of Treasury. I wanted to explore with you a few of these ideas that we've kicked around at different points, not getting into super futuristic mode, but touch on some of these topics. And maybe before we talk about things like AI, machine learning, ChatGPT, what happens with staff in Treasury, how will that change? What do we need to look at? I wanted to just talk for a few moments about the context of Treasury and hear your thoughts. I also had a few thoughts as well. I think we're all seeing a recognition of increased volatility. Inflation has risen. Central banks are trying to tamp down inflation, so rates are rising. We see ongoing volatility with FX, but also with commodities. And it seems to me, and from what we're seeing, is Treasury's role has been elevated since the last financial crisis, 2008, 2009, has stayed high and has had additional respect of late with forecasting and expectations placed on them. More challenges. What are some of the things that you would see in terms of the expectations on Treasury or some of the new requirements on Treasury?
Treasury, we saw in the global financial crisis, Treasury got elevated and more corporations, treasurers getting a seat at the table to be a big part of those conversations. What's happening with the business? As I say, businesses are just like humans. Every one of them are different. With the volatility and, like you said, in the currency markets, interest rates and commodities, and even logistics, right? And shipping and containers and the prices there, they're having substantial impacts on the financial results. And so that is where the board of directors and CEO, they want to ring up the treasurer and get some answers to that. What are we doing about it? And what are the thoughts? And can you put together a presentation for the board to get to walk them through it, where we're at and why we're here. And, and I think a lot of it is for the last, let's say 20, 30 years, at least since the global financial crisis, right? We've been into this low to no interest rate environment. And I think it's brought along with it a lot of complacency, which is humanly natural. When things are steady and you don't see a lot of volatility in the markets, you get comfortable. That's one thing that you and I know. You can never get comfortable, never get complacent. It's constant learning, constant growing.
Never could or never should. Maybe that's. But you're right. It's like if it's like rates are low, money is cheap. That's not one of your first few items to look at. But the future changes. Some good points there: the volatility, improving recognition, and expectations. But I wanted to shift and talk a little bit about AI, machine learning. I guess I'll give some background. That's like, what technologies are going to change Treasury the most? When I think about machine learning, the ability to detect patterns, there's a lot of things happening in Treasury already. Anything that can detect patterns can be good for quality control, tracking and monitoring fraud, anomalous behavior. It can help with forecasting in certain ways as it's guided, and there's lots of room to grow there. Those are all underway in a sense. But when we think about things like ChatGPT is pretty big of late. You type stuff in, it gives some type of answers. What are you thinking about AI and machine learning in the future? How is that going to impact Treasury? You may have some stories about ChatGPT. I've got one as well, but
it's a hot topic right now. And I think it's a very important, critical topic. I think it's important to kind of give an overview just for our treasurers, and especially some of the younger treasurers. I would first say there's nothing like a human. The way we're set up, the way we function, the way our organs work, and we are a being that is far superior in holistic view than any machines ever.
So take that, ChatGPT.
So take that from the start. I think I did my first Python, so machine learning demonstration at Eurofinance in Copenhagen back in 2019. I first spoke on it in 2017 when it was about conversation about RPA and about machine learning and about how AI was going to impact. And back in 2017, I had no idea the progression, the acceleration. And as you and I talk about a lot, right, we boil it down to you have the storage capacity to store data, and it's gotten cheaper and cheaper to store an insane amount of data. And then you have data creation, so the tools to capture data and the amount of data that everyone started to realize 5 years or longer, this data is valuable. The value of the data that we create as a business every year has an extreme amount of value. So we build these mega projects, but this data is very valuable. So, and then it's the compute power. So thanks to our friends at NVIDIA, and we know Chris, treasurer of NVIDIA, great guy. You had CPU, then they invented GPU, and you have TPU. So the compute power is just, it's expanding, accelerating like crazy. And then DevOps. So these developers, our next generation of leaders that are younger than you and I, closer to Jonathan's age, they're brilliant. And they are developing stuff that is just amazing. And so from an AI perspective, and you know how I feel about AI, I mean, don't like the term, I like machine learning, artificial narrow intelligence. But when you say AI, 95% of the population thinks of ASI or AGI, artificial superintelligence or AI like it's behaving and can act like a human, which is not, we're not there. But I've given in and I've accepted we'll call it AI. And so, but really, it all started, 2012 was a really big period where you had the CNN, and CNN, not the TV station, but convolutional neural networks, which did amazing work with image recognition. And for us in Treasury, optical character recognition, this is where, hey, Treasury, you get all these invoices bombarded into your AP department, and they may come in a paper form, they may come in an email, they may come in a PDF, they may come in a Word document. You never know how those are going to come in. And there's a lot of systems for collecting that. But OCR, optical character recognition really gave us the ability to build technologies that would go in and decipher all of that and put it into our ERP language for our specific business. Then along came RNN, so the recurrent neural network. That was more in the, natural language processing, so the NLP. The problem with that, it solved a lot of things, but it was slow. When you really wanted to go out and scrape a lot of data, RNNs they just weren't really fast and really good at that. So sequence is a big issue. The RNNs had trouble with sequence. And so then we fast forward to 2017. What really changed everything was a paper written by, and I won't say their names because I'll mispronounce them, but it was about attention. And the importance of attention in machine learning. And so that's what created the transformer. And then the transformers is what is all over the news. And so that took RNN, but made it super fast. So then you could train on a bunch of data and you could train quickly. So ChatGPT is the one that's all over the news. But there's also BERT and there's T5. These are generative models. There's another one that I follow that's not really big into the news, but Stable Diffusion, a young man from India who's a genius. He's behind Stable Diffusion. And I love the guy because those other models aren't open source. Stable Diffusion, Stable AI, is open source. He's released it. And one of his big goals is education. So they can scrape 2 terabytes worth of data, and they can get that down to, they can run the machines, they can get it down to 2 gigabytes. They can put it on an iPhone, a laptop, tablet of some sort. And his goal, they can distribute it, right, to developing countries where they don't have the privilege of education as a lot of us do. And so his estimates were 13, an hour a day for 13 months, read and write. Can teach reading and writing to a young person using that, which education is a key to me, is one of the huge keys. And, I'm big on the United Nations and the 17 sustainability goals, and education for children, is really important to me. But then you have like ChatGPT, which is basically 45 terabytes of data. It's trained on 45 terabytes of data, which is essentially all of Web 2. I can't even think in 45 terabytes of data. And it's scraping all of that data, right? And then it's generative AI. So these transformers are generative AI. And that's what we've all been playing with for the past few months, is ChatGPT. And Stable Diffusion is open source, but it's really more text to image is their focus right now. But it's definitely going to impact Treasury.
Yeah, so on the generative, well, especially generative image, I mean, it's fun to say, make a football player riding an ostrich running across the surface of a moon or something. It's like, and it creates some image. It's like, well, that's better than I could draw. It's kind of odd, but it's the ability to put those things together. When you look at something like ChatGPT and we think about Treasury, what is going to help us? And we already talked about some of the things that are already underway in Treasury. And so the power of the tools to manage some of that activity, for things like natural language search, the ability to scale, those are very, very helpful tools, far more advanced, or they're at least a step above. When I think of some of the things that Treasury has to do is much more analysis, risk management, looking at the future. It's not just capturing data about the past. And so when I think of what jobs are going to be displaced, we already see that in things like audit jobs, where you're piling through data, looking at patterns, detecting issues, by matching stuff. The consulting firms, audit firms, are putting massive amounts of effort there because it is faster than, the Army's audit. You still have people guiding the activities, monitoring it, but they're setting these tools as like, instead of having 50 people dig with a shovel, you put these tools out there and it's a giant earth mover. And it's far faster than the mass of people. It still needs to be guided, directed, managed, and summarized, but it's displacing a lot of people in some of those fields. Treasury is not staffed heavily, even though we've seen, over the last, at least 8 years, Treasury groups on average have been adding, 12 to 18 or 20% of those groups have added people every year. It's general growth. It's still been very thinly staffed. So how is it going to impact it? This is kind of to your question about what will go on. If you asked me 10 years ago and 15 years ago, I always had this idea that it would be great if we could, do cash positioning, forecasting, funds movements, a lot of the core cash management activities in the Treasury domain. If you could set that up so, it's called gamification now, but if you could set up so you could make it available like a fun game that people would optimize where things go, that would be pretty cool. I don't think that's going to happen at all. The reason being is, you can now develop rules to handle that activity, and that can be guided by people. And so we continue to see that develop. But to your point, if we look at some of the things on like ChatGPT as an example, you ask questions like, give me a summary of this or tell me about these things. It provides a pretty interesting summary of things. And I remember plugged something in, there were 6 responses and 2 are quite good. I mean, they're kind of generic, but 2 are quite good. Mm-hmm. 1 was okay, probably needed a little more calibration on it. Mm-hmm. And 1 was like, this is not right. In terms of the equivalency of, if you have an intern in, you say, give me a summary of these things, do some research, and they're going to come back to you 4 days later, and they're going to give you something that probably wasn't much better than that, or most of them won't. But it still needs to be guided by someone with a bit more wisdom. So that's the general focus of that, like searching for what goes on. What can we do with AI machine learning that can detect patterns in different ways? I think of the risk area. Like, since we're looking at the future, we're always looking to see, are there correlations, dependent and independent variables? And we've been limited in the past to limited amounts of data. We make decisions. Like you and I were talking about, like you have a stand at the beach, you have ice cream and suntan and umbrellas and stuff. It's like, how much are you going to sell of whatever? It's like, okay, ice cream might be related to temperature. Like what's the temperature? How many people are at the beach could be related to school days or, whatever. Some of those elements that you can see how, hey, when I'm hot, I'm more likely to get ice cream, or you're more likely to buy it when you're on vacation as opposed to during the year. So those are all things that you have a logical, estimate or hypothesis, and you can set it up against data, like what's the weather forecast for 4 days. So that's probably the most guided areas. But one of the things, you and I talk about, FX risk and some of these other commodity price risk. If we think about big data too, tie in big data, it's like we lack data. Now we have massive amounts of data. If we put that data in a place where we could use, AI and machine learning to search and said, here's a range of data sets. Try to find at least correlations between individual items and combination of items, things that we may not think of. You would never say, I want to hire 12 interns and say, spend entire summer cycling through this whole list of items trying to find correlations. But we should be able to set some of the machines to cycle through that, see if there's any correlations or indicators. We could test the strength of those. And I wonder if there is opportunities there, particularly on the risk area, to capture more about risk and find correlations. So especially when we think about what are the big challenges for Treasury protecting the risk assets. One is we tend to diminish those items that have a very significant impact but are very low likelihood. High likelihood, moderate, high likelihood, high risk, where everyone's all over that. But it's kind of like, we build on floodplains, we build by the ocean, even though there's rocks on the hill in Japan that say, don't build below this point, because we forget it, because it's infrequent. I wonder if this is something that can help keep those things top of mind and weight those so that we think about them more regularly. We avoid the tails. Mm-hmm. We minimize. That's a really long tail. It's so small. Those are some of the things kicking in my mind. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack, Craig. But let me start with, so to your point, and I completely agree with you. So Tim, Treasury from Medtronic, he and I on LinkedIn had traded a couple things maybe a month ago or so on ChatGPT. He tried a little experiment and then I tried a little experiment. And mine was about the yen. And let's just say you were a Japanese pension fund and you were buying 10-year US Treasuries and you were hedging the currency exposure of that with hedges, shorter term rolling. All right. So then you get into, it's a very complex question, right? Because then you get into repricing risk and where's the arbitrage in the curve to optimize. And then if the US starts raising interest rates, all of a sudden, then all of a sudden economically it doesn't make sense. So then you have Japanese investors selling US Treasuries because it no longer makes financial sense to that. So I posed a question to ChatGPT and it didn't give me an answer like a human that has spent, 15, 20 years in the business and knows, but it gave me 4 things to think about. Like and just to your point, like an analyst, It may take them 4 days to come back with those same kind of 4. Here are some things to think about. Very high, very general, but it happened in 8 seconds, right? So I completely agree with you. And on the staffing, as you say, you're seeing treasurers staffing up. I would agree with you. It's no longer optional to have technology awareness and to create an innovative culture. And as George Zen, former treasurer of Microsoft, taught me, don't make it a know-it-all culture. Make sure it's a learn-it-all culture. And so I think it's even more important that treasurers are leaders. Excellent. Mine, as you heard yesterday, are excellence, confidence, and humility, but understand the importance of DE&I. So as they're making these hires, hire people that look different than the rest of the team. They have a different background than the rest of the team. They have different life experiences than the rest of the team. They may not even have treasury experience, but be diverse in your hiring, and it has to include the technology, so my oldest daughter, my oldest son studied in college data science, software engineering, because I think it's going to be extremely important. But I also told him, you need to study psychology at the same time and take a few electives in neuroscience. So I think as you see these treasurers staffing up, those are going to be areas where if they do that right and they do it strategically and they have a good diverse, they're going to get a lot. Because I think one of the most dangerous things to the world right now is groupthink and propaganda. But groupthink is very dangerous.
Like confirmation bias type thing.
Yeah.
You hire people who are, it doesn't have to be across some of those dimensions that you're talking about. It could be, we have this view of risk in the same way, and we minimize this tail. Mm-hmm. And we're like, well, that's so rare, it wouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. So that ability to complement each other's thinking in terms, especially when we're talking about risk management.
Yeah. And your other point that I really love, as we're using these tools, how can we take the transformers and where we have large amounts of data, and that's where it can be dangerous, because whatever you train the model on, that data is really critical, right? Because if it's a bunch of ugly data, it's a bunch of propaganda data, I mean, you never know what you're going to get out on the other end. So when you, like you said, if you take that to treasury and finance and you start to train it on financial market data, I think you're right. I think that's where we have the opportunity to really pick out correlations, relationships, causation from things that we try to spend as much time as we can on thinking through these things, but to have a machine that can think, it can run millions of iterations and say, hey, something that we would not, it's not that easy. I have a stand on the beach, and when it rains, I sell umbrellas, and when the sun's out, I sell sunscreen. It's, our world, and especially in the financial markets. And, like we talked about yesterday, I think macroeconomics is where the treasurer has the ability to really add value to the business. And like I said, treasurers need to see around corners, right? And the only way you see around corners is with the mirrors. And to me, the mirrors is to be, spend as much time as you can thinking through these new innovations and the opportunities that it brings to treasury.
When you were talking there, a couple things came to mind, but one I'll share was this idea of the data and the quality of data that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. We use BI, and we have, I'll just call them programs that grab data and pull information back. And so one thing we're looking at is, what's changed with earnings credit rates and all these different curve information that's changing. It's pretty volatile. Well, we changed some of the data that's coming in and said, let's look at it from a year perspective as opposed to month by month. It pulls beginning of the year, off the FRED database as opposed to like the end of the year. Yeah. And so that fed into one of the charts, and we're looking at it, it's like, that can't be right. Because instead of looking at monthly, we looked at it yearly, and it was noticeable, very noticeable to the human eye, because those rates have gone up quite a bit. I mean, the Fed has raised rates. ECR rates have gone up. I mean, all these things have changed dramatically. If it had been very stable, I wonder if we would have caught that on a report. Now, of course, we may not have put it on a report if it hadn't been moving, but that was one of those things where you get the data, but there's also assumptions like, hey, let's pull this. And someone else in some other system has a different view of what this data is and what they need to show. And so that's just an issue of, you can't just like let the machines run wild. Mm-hmm. There has to be validation. And then you have to know where that comes from and then repair and fixing those. I know we can talk about this a really long time. If we're talking about the future of Treasury, there's these technologies that you've been describing and expounding on quite well. I want to think about the people. You've already talked about some of those things, having the ability to have a team that complements one another, and which is really what you're talking about when you talk about some of the diversity of thought experiences, right? Someone sees risk, you're like, I never saw a risk there. But in the example, when we were talking yesterday, someone said, what are the biggest risks? And it's like, well, if you talk to the U.S., it's like, what spy balloons have flown over the U.S.? Like that is a bigger issue. But when you talk to Europeans, I was just at a conference not too long ago, and it was like all the Europeans, like, we have war in Europe. And that's not what you hear in the U.S. Well, that's closer to them, a bigger impact. So we've got these regional things, and those are the types of things that influence, how you look at things. You're like, oh, they're seeing this as a bigger issue than we're seeing this. They probably could care less about actual spy balloons or, science projects that we shot down with an $800,000 missile. But that's part of the, how do we understand risk? Where do we have our blind spots? Let me give you this story, and then maybe we talk about what's necessary from a employee perspective or mindset. I've shared this before, so hopefully those that are listening on the podcast don't get mad. I'm not sure if I told you this. There's companies that the Zoomers, right, that age cohort, mm-hmm. they left, and now a manager, a director, or assistant treasurer is having to try to fill that position, and they're doing these very manual functions. Why did the Zoomer leave? They didn't want to spend time keying in all this information. And you're saying like, okay, there's one part of me that wants to say, oh, you're just not willing to work hard, right? That's the negative view towards Zoomers or millennials or whatever. It's like, you're not willing to work hard. But think about it, they're actually being very intelligent there. It's like, I can go somewhere else and I don't have to key stuff in. What's the value to me keying stuff in all the time? And I don't see it's going to get relieved in a while. And I can work for at least as much money, have a better experience at another firm, either across the street or I'm still working out of my office at home. And to them, that makes perfect sense. And you know what? It does make sense. We have the tech to avoid that. And so we might provide staffing for that company and help them automate that so they can hire someone who's not doing those terrible things. And it's not just by age cohorts. Age cohorts can give us some generalizations, but I think there's some value of, hey, we're willing to work hard no matter what it takes, and we're not willing to put up with bad technology. What are some things you think about in terms of the technology mindset that Treasury has to lean into harder, move into more rapidly?
No, you're exactly right, and that's an area that I think I would score myself as a Treasury leader lower on, just because these young professionals are extremely intelligent. And like you said, they want to use their intelligence, and I'm big on mentoring. So I have, over the years, I can think of Julian, Michael, Trevor, of just bright young people. And Julian is a Chinese descent, master's degree. She is a superstar. So eventually, we didn't have the tools at the time. So she now works for Fred at Technip FMC, and it was a promotion for her, and I helped facilitate. I was so happy to see her move into a role where she can be more analytical. But these tools are definitely going to help a lot with that. On the dangerous side, there's a list of dangerous things, right, with this technology, with generative AI. And the deep fakes. So it's one thing when we get, I've gotten the email on my personal email and on my work email from the CEO. Okay, so what if I get a phone call from him? Now, generative AI can do that. What if he sets up hey, Todd, I want to talk to you video conference real quick. Let's jump on a Zoom. The technology exists. I could have a face-to-face Zoom call with him. It's scary. That's scary.
The face-to-face Zoom call with Tom Cruise, right? It's like, that's That's a great deepfake.
Yeah. And so then if we move to and I love your positives. And so I made a quick list of positives. And one of the things is I'm still alive. So 25 years of driving and 25 years of driving, and I've never been in an auto accident. And I tell my kids, it's because I raced quarter midget race cars when I was 4 or 5 years old. And so I learned how to drive. But I can tell you, my wife bought this new Escalade thing, and it's got the driver assist. And so that driver assist has saved me. I'm not kidding you. At least 3 times, that driver assist has stopped that huge truck. And I have 6 kids. So, it has paid for itself. I mean, you can't put a price on it.
I owe Mr. Rumble money too for waking me up on a long drive.
Yeah. So some of the things I'm really excited about are, in my past, I've done a lot of business just due to the nature of Fluor in remote countries, emerging markets, where they have different finance ministries. The regulations, the restrictions on banking are all different. Imagine I have to do so much work on tax structure, on, working with tax, working with legal, working with the banks, the onshore, the offshore banks, and figuring out, okay, how am I going to run a $5 billion project through this country? How much content has to be onshore with local craft labor? You take like Mongolia, I don't know what it is now, but it used to be you had to run all incoming out. It had to touch the Mongolian currency through. So those are things, restrictions on how deep is the market for that currency, and you and I have talked before. I think I have the world's record for trading the largest block of Kuwaiti dinar, which is an extremely illiquid, well, not extremely, but compared to the majors, it's kind of an illiquid currency. So imagine you could pose this to the machine and it doesn't give you all the perfect answers, but if you train it on the right data, it could tell me, hey, this is what you're going to experience in this country, and you need to watch out for this, this, this. And this is insane because the amount of time, and these people that I work with, these attorneys and tax professionals, they make serious money. So an hour of their time is very expensive. And on the flip side, I think, it's going to combat fraud, reconciliation, forecasts versus actuals. I heard our friend Bob Stark from Kariba talk about the potential forecast versus actuals, and to me that's rate, volume, and mix shift. Plan, how did you do actuals, versus what you plan to do, or year over year. Documentation, controlling documentations, and then imagine the machine, from a controls, policies, procedures, and auditing perspective. You can run certain data through there and you can get tipped off, hey, Craig, you can place this, $500 million interest rate swap, but you're in violation of this or this, or you don't have the board approval. And at that notional amount, you need board approval. So it really tips you off to just an extra layer of safety there that I think will be extremely valued.
I feel we've just gotten started, but someone's actually coming into our room, so
yeah.
So we need to end it.
We got to head to the swimming pool. So let's get to the beach. Todd. No, thank you. It's great to be here in sunny Orlando. It's beautiful.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.